Hi, I'm going to talk to you today about a really important word in yoga and in the Yoga Sutras called KAIVALYAM. And this word is going to help you to understand why yoga does not mean union. And in fact, it means more like separation. So let me tell you why. Okay, we're going to start with the Yoga Sutras. This is my preferred translation. Remember, I've reminded you before that not all translations are created equal. The translator has to have a handle, a firm handle on both languages in order to properly translate the words. If the translator does not have a nice, healthy repertoire of words, a vocabulary to choose from, we will end up with a weak, if not just wrong, translation. So we have to be careful about translations first and foremost. We can't just settle for anything. We have to keep looking and we have to keep striving for the best. And this is the best that I know of, this one by Michael Beloved. The translation, the commentary, excellent. So we're going to start here with our Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And I'm going to tell you that in chapter 1, verse 2, Patanjali tells us what the goal of yoga is and how we will know that we've accomplished it. So let's start there. So here we have the Sanskrit, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Many of you are probably familiar with that. It's kind of an iconic yogic scriptural sutra that oftentimes people refer to. It's oftentimes maybe the only sutra that they really know. Okay, so what does this translate into? Let me read to you exactly this translation. I've got most of it up here, but not the whole thing. The skill of yoga is demonstrated by the conscious non-operation of the vibrational modes of the mental emotional energy. So let me summarize that in another way. The skill of yoga is demonstrated when you are aware that you have stopped your mind and your emotions from fluctuating. There is no fluctuation in the energies of your psyche, of your mind and emotions. This is when you know that you have accomplished the skill of yoga. And what must one do to accomplish such a thing? Can you imagine? Can you do that? Can you sit in a meditative state and cause the energies of your mind and emotions to stop? Sometimes people can do it for a millisecond. Sometimes they can do it after practice for 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes hours. Let's move on. So that's Patanjali in the first chapter, the Transcendence chapter, when he's going to explain to us what yoga is and how it's going to benefit us. That's the first chapter, okay? Now, in the second chapter, this is where we find Patanjali listing the 8 limbs of yoga, the 8-limbed yoga practice, okay? And so we have the yamas and the niyamas, the restraints and the moral obligations. The yamas and the niyamas are how we live our everyday lives and certain observances that we make and certain bodily cleansing techniques that we do. Then we have the asana, which are the postures, the yoga postures, the exercises, and they are done with the pranayama. The asana and the pranayama are done together as one exercise to cleanse and purify the physical and the psychic body. And why do we do that? We do that so that we can practice the higher stages of yoga. So the bridge between these lower levels of yoga and the higher levels of yoga is the pratyahara, right there in the middle, the 5th one, number 5, pratyahara. This is our bridge into mystic awareness, into dharana, dhyan, and samadhi, the higher stages of sequential, progressive meditation practice, leading to this samadhi, super important word in yoga. It translates to complete insight, samadhi, complete insight. Okay, moving along. We keep going through the Yoga Sutras. So that second chapter is on the practices. So the first chapter is on like Patanjali telling us of the transcendence that's going to happen because of doing this yoga. The second chapter is actually the practice. He's going to tell us these 8 limbs and he's going to explain them, some in small detail and some in longer detail. And then the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras is glory displayed. This is what this chapter is called, glory displayed. And what do we do in chapter 3? But we find Patanjali telling us how to apply our samadhi, this samadhi that we've achieved, this complete insight, and what kinds of things we should apply that insight, that new level of transcendent insight, what we should apply it to. He gives us suggestions, and some of which I've talked about in another video about yoga and the flat earth and the pole star, because he specifically mentions the pole star, applying our complete insight to the stars, to the solar, to the sun, to the moon, to the sky. I think that's really cool. The fourth chapter, here we go, finally, to separation yoga. We find that the fourth chapter of the Yoga Sutras is called KAIVALYA, KAIVALYam. And what does this translate to? So Michael Beloved here has translated Kaivalya Pada, the chapter heading for chapter 4 of the Yoga Sutras. Translation, segregation accomplishment, segregation, another word for separation. So why does yoga mean separation? We can go back to Chitta Vritti Nirodha and see why. We have to silence and calm and stabilize the mind and emotions. And how are you going to do that? Are you going to be able to do that by identifying with your mind and emotions and feeling as if you are them? Or are you going to have to practice some sort of detachment? Some kind of internal detachment process. Yes, and that's where segregation, separation, Kaivalyam comes in. And we find him finally use the word, Patanjali finally uses the word in verse 26. And here's what he says. So after all of this practice that we've done and we've learned from the whole of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali says in verse 26, chapter 4, thus indeed, the mental emotional force is inclined toward discrimination and gravitates toward the total separation from the mundane psychology. So our tendency after all of this practice is going to be a total separation from your mundane way of thinking, your mundane mentality. It doesn't mean boring, it just means what it is. It is what it is, it's the reality. But it's still mundane. And then as we go to the very, very last verse, the very last verse of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali says this, it's glorious, it's wonderful. Separation of the spirit from the mental emotional energy occurs when there is a neutrality in respect to the influence of material nature, when the yogi's psyche becomes devoid of the general aims of a human being. Thus, at last, the spirit is established in its own form as the force empowering the mental emotional energy. So this doesn't mean that you've necessarily transcended out of your body and you no longer have a physical or emotional body. It means that you've turned the tables. And now the self, he calls it the swarup. That's the word that Patanjali uses in the sutras, swarup. Synonyms would be like atma and purusha in the spiritual self. So at the end of this, we find separation. We find Patanjali telling us it's okay to distance yourself from your mind and your emotions. We have Patanjali telling us that this is the only way that you're going to become the force that is empowering the mind and emotions. This is a really big deal. For the self, if you even believe in the self, your eternal, perpetual unit of existence that is you, indestructible, transmigratable, obviously. You're here in this bodysuit. You've transmigrated before and will again. When that entity, the self, becomes the power figure in this system, then we have accomplished KAIVALYAM. 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 Separation. And that separation is so necessary to the progress and hopefully transcendence of the being. But instead, we have a whole New Age culture, even of Indians, that are going around saying that yoga means union, and it's the union of your body, mind, and soul. Well, what do you want to unify with your body and mind for? They aren't you. They're experiences, they're tools, they're mechanisms, they're programs. You can't unify with them because you're not them. What you have to do is get them on your side, get them to cooperate with your higher desires, your spiritual hopes and dreams and aspirations. The body and the mind need to cooperate with your spiritual aspirations, and this is not an easy thing to do. Getting that Kundalini life force to change its ways is one of the most difficult things that a being can do in this plane of existence. So anyway, I hope that this made sense. Yoga means more of separation than it does union. And we can follow this in the book, in the lessons from Patanjali. So thanks for listening. If you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. I appreciate it. Thanks.